what we saw even in that home rental segment, they are still struggling. I think there's some concerns, especially with competition like Airbnb out there. And then also, I think, in listening to the conference call, there was a decision, I think, to streamline a lot of its brands to further emphasize VRBO. So I think that will likely hurt the stock in the short term, although I do think over the long term, it makes sense to put more emphasis, especially when it comes to SEO and getting just an optimized ranking on Google sites, because Google is both friend and foe in this space. And so I think short-term headwinds for Expedia, but I think long-term, their renewed focus in this space makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a short-term, let's call it legislative problem, that the whole concept of renting out your home for short-term basis has been dealt with in a lot of tourist markets or some of the bigger cities, but the vast majority of the country still has to decide sort of how it's going to handle it. I know that in my building, and I live in downtown West Palm Beach, Florida, you are only allowed to rent your property 11 times a year, and it has to be for at least a month. So some people rent for shorter terms and find clever ways around it by writing the lease for a month, and some people just flaunt the rules, and that's going to become an issue. There's going to be taxation, there's going to be pushback from hotels, and for the next 2 or 3 years, I expect there to be a little bit of instability in that business as you see certain cities crack down, certain cities lighten up, but that is all going to get worked out largely because you can see where the economy is going. We're past the point where sort of this whole, gig economy and Airbnb and VRBO sort of fit into that. It's an individual renting out their home to make extra money for the most part. That's all going to happen. And so the near-term outlook is maybe a little bit uneven for that business. The 3 to 5 year outlook is that this is going to be a growth area, and Expedia owns one of the two names that matters in the space.
Yeah, and so that entire segment, houses, apartments, non-hotel like properties, they make up about 20% of all accommodations out there. So you could see this certainly gaining traction over time, but you made a great point just about the regulatory landscape. Very similar to with Uber and Lyft. They're plowing ahead and regulations then have to catch up. So I think, in the short term, you're going to continue to see some headwinds there. But Dan, if you had to pick as an investor between Booking Holdings and Expedia, which would you say is your top pick?
Well, I'm going to go and point out that I wouldn't invest in either for the reason I spoke of before. I think every brand that I'm regularly a customer of is going to figure out how to have a direct relationship with me. And that is going to cut away some of my business from third-party booking services. If I had to pick, I believe in the Priceline branding more than I believe in sort of the Expedia travel agent model. I think people want a deal, and I don't think the core Expedia offering sort of offers a deal. Convenience, and it's a very good product. It does, the technology is all great, but Priceline is somewhat of that lottery where you might save a lot of money. And I think, just for that reason, I'd be more inclined to do that. But honestly, I wouldn't invest in either one.
Yeah, I can see the argument on both sides. I think if I had to choose one, it would probably be Booking.com. I think that massive global presence, granted, it's no longer a growth story, and it's not a growth story for Expedia either right now, but I think that massive European presence and their partnerships that they're making with OTAs in China as well are intriguing to me. I think as Booking tries to really strengthen its network effects through acquisitions and really trying to stand up a lot of these other verticals that they're going after, I think the concern for me is with so many different brands, and this even applies to Expedia, how do they make sure that they stay focused? Because at one point, Booking, I think, was even into mortgages. They were doing gas. I do worry about that over time, but I'd say just given the size and the scale and having that, especially when you're competing with the likes of Google and Amazon, I would probably give the hat tip to Booking.
And to give a last thought, we mentioned OpenTable. So Booking owns OpenTable, which is a restaurant reservation service. And they make money by the restaurants paying them. I don't know if it's per booking or that there's a monthly fee, but It's a different model. What they've been doing recently is integrating OpenTable into Priceline, probably other services as well, but I've seen it at Priceline. So when you go in to look at your hotel room, you have a button right there that says show nearby restaurants, and it shows them in OpenTable, and you can very easily make a reservation. It takes some of the guesswork out of, geez, how far from my hotel is that restaurant? And you could see that becoming a platform where it integrates across a lot more areas that sort of gives an added value to what Priceline, what Booking.com, what all their other services are doing in general. So, it's kind of an outlier of a product, but it actually strengthens the whole brand. And frankly, it makes a lot more sense than being the Priceline of mortgages, which I think they were at one point.
Yeah, totally true. And they're also doing this attractions business where they're trying to generate some revenue off of some of the activities and tours and things that you do when you go to some of these cities. So they're certainly trying. Again, this is not a growth story. And I think if you're an investor, as long as you recognize this isn't really a growth story right now, it's going to be slow going. But all in all, I mean, I think staying away until I think we get a better idea of what is going to happen on the competitive landscape makes the most sense.